Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carlos. I'm a web developer based in Brooklyn, New York, and today we're going to work on a project called Match Game from the Build Websites from Scratch course. So to complete this project, if you've been following along the previous units, at this point you should be familiar with JavaScript. You should know how to do iterations, how to write loops. You should know how to write functions, how to create them, assign them to variables, and pass them around. You should also know how to write conditionals and create variables and reassign them. And you should be familiar with scoping as well. So we're going to be running variables and passing them around into other functions as well. And same with calling functions. You should also know how to write HTML and CSS, how to write an HTML boilerplate. We're going to be working a lot with HTML and creating a front-end design for a game. So you should know how to write tags, how to pass them around, how to write classes for all these elements. And lastly, you should be familiar with jQuery. We might have not gone in depth with jQuery, so there might be some event handlers that are not familiar to you, but that's totally fine. We will provide some hints in order for you to look them up. And jQuery has a very large documentation as well, so a very extensive amount of handy functions that they provide. So feel free to look at the documentation as well if something is a little unfamiliar to you. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so for step one, all we're going to do is you're going to download this link we have here and go ahead and unzip it in your local machine. And let's go ahead and get that started. I already have mine downloaded, so I'm going to go ahead and skip to step number 2 here. Okay, so once you have downloaded your project, go ahead and open it in your own text editor. I already have it set up here. So you'll see we have an index.html file, which is basically the boilerplate for our match game. We have another folder inside our project folder that has called resources. Inside there, we have another folder called JS, which contains our scripts for the match game and some actual tests that we have provided for you so we can run them on the console, on developer console, and see if they pass or not. And lastly, we also have a little icon here that will be displayed in our little tag for the browser when you actually open the link. So let's go ahead and open up the index.html. I'm just going to copy the path, and then I'm going to open it in a different browser. So I have it opened up here. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little more and open up my dev console. Okay, looking good. Let's go back to the instructions. And we're going to go ahead and open up our DevTools from Chrome. And we're going to run the test to see them fail. So they should be failing right now since we actually haven't filled out the rest of our JavaScript. So we have basically 4 tests that we're going to be running. We have one called generate card values, we have render cards, and then flip cards. And we have one other test that actually logs the errors here. So if we go back into our folder and we look at our tests, we see we have one object called match game tests. Within that object, we have other functions that we have created, which are tests. So we're running test generate card values, we're running test render cards, and test flip card, and then we have a log errors as well. So as we go ahead and write the rest of our JavaScript on matchgame.js, these tests will be passing. So this is kind of a test-driven development philosophy where we'll write some tests, make sure they fail first, then we'll write some code, then make the test pass, and then at the end maybe refactor it a little bit. So let's go ahead and back to the instructions, and we'll move on to step number 3. For step number 3, we're going to go ahead onto Bootstrap's website. If you open up the hint and you go to this link here, it will direct you to a Codecademy article, and inside there you'll have a link to the actual Bootstrap site where you can actually grab the CDN for that. So we're going to grab the Bootstrap library and we're going to link it in our index.html file. So I already have it copied in order to save some time. So I'm going to go back into my index.html file, and we're going to go ahead and pass it in here right above above our title. Actually, below our title is fine. So I have it copy pasted, and all we need is just a minified library here. So we have a minified CSS file, which is basically the Bootstrap library. Go ahead and save that as well, and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, in step number 4, we're simply going to add a Bootstrap container with 1 row. And we should know at this point how Bootstrap works with containers. So they have their own CSS styling for certain class names. So we're going to go inside our body here. We're going to create a div, and we're going to add a class to that div, and we're simply going to go to container. Inside that div, we're also going to add a div with a class row. So Bootstrap will take into account all these classes and know how to style them according to the library it contains. So let's go back here and let's move on to step number 5. So in step number 5, within the row we just created, we're also going to add a div for the game instructions. So this little container here, we're going to create a div there, and it will contain that information. So we got to make sure that the bootstrap classes is created so that it takes up about 1/4 of the container's width on devices with a screen width greater than 992 pixels, and all of the containers width on devices narrower than 992 pixels. So container devices that are narrower than 992 pixels implies basically like cell phones or mobile devices or small tablets, for example. So in case you didn't know, containers in Bootstrap are basically based off 12 columns. So if we want the div to contain 1/4 of the container's width, we can simply call a class and specify how many columns we actually want it to take up. So let's go back into our HTML file here. Let's create a div here, a div, and let's out our class here. So Bootstrap uses what we like to call specific classes in order to specify the rows. So if we want this class to take up 1/4 of 12 rows, that means we're basically going to do 3 columns. So for devices that have a greater width of 992 pixels, we can call MD with these columns. So we're going to specify column D, and we want to make sure it takes up to 3 rows. And for devices that are smaller than that, we want it to take up all the rows. So we can simply call MD, which is another class we're going to do, and then, XS for extra small devices. And we want them to take up all the rows. So we're going to add a 12 there, so it specifies how many rows we're actually going to take. Okay, looking good so far. Let's go ahead and move on to step 6. Okay, for step 6, within the same row we just created, we're going to add another div for the actual game. So these cards here, this is the game itself. And this div should take 3/4 of the container's width on devices with a screen width greater than 992 pixels, and all of the container's width on devices are narrower than 992 pixels. And we're also going to add an ID of game to that element. So let's go back to our project here. And we're going to add this div right below the div that we just created above for the instructions. So let's create a div right here. And similar to the other div, we're going to add a class, and we want it to take 3/4. So instead of that having 3/4 of 12, which would be 9. And so we're going to take up 9 columns. We're going to use the same thing we did with the previous div. So column D with 9 rows. And in order for it to take all the rows in extra small devices, we only have to specify how many rows it's going to be taken here. And lastly, let's also add an ID of game to this div here. Okay, let's go back to our project here, and we can move on to actually adding some stuff to our HTML. For step number 7, we're going to start filling out the game instructions div. So we're going to add a header and paragraph elements, and we're going to add the text from the design specs. So if we look back into the specs here, we see that we have H1 header, which is the title of the game. Then we have a rule, which will be an H2 header, a paragraph, another H2 header, and then another paragraph that explains how to win. So let's go back here, and I'm going to add in my first H1 tag here. I'm just going to fill out the tags first, and then we can fill in the content before that. Let's do another H2, which will be the rules of the game. We'll add a paragraph, so we explain the rules of the game. And then let's add another H2, which will be how to win. And lastly, let's add another paragraph. Okay, so we know that the H1 header will be the title of the game, which will be match game. And in order to save some time, I'm going to copy paste the rules of the game. But before that, let's fill out H2. So rules, I believe it's rules. Yeah, rules. And I have copied the actual rules here, so I'm just going to paste them right below the rules header. Then we will write how to win. And lastly, we will write what it says here. You win when all pairs have been found. You win when all pairs have been found. Okay, go ahead and save that. Let's go back into our actual HTML and see how it's displayed here. Okay, it's looking good so far. We can notice that it's actually taken up 1/4 of the container. And if we actually investigate here and look it up, we'll see that we have the container, which is basically what's been holding this, and we have the body here and the actual row itself. Okay, it's looking good. Let's go back into the instructions and fill out the rest. So for step number 8, within the game div, we're going to add another bootstrap row, and this row will contain the game's cards. So let's go back down here. We have our div container for the game. We're going to add a row here, and we're going to make sure it has a class of row. And inside this, we're going to be adding what would be card elements. So I'll just comment this out for now. Go ahead and save that as well, and we'll move on to step number 9. For step number 9, we're going to add 16 divs representing cards to the game row. So each of these elements should take up a fourth of the row on all devices, and they should have a class of card. Okay, so let's go back to the project. We're going to add a div here. We're going to add a class, and now in order for it to take all the rows, we know that we have to take all the rows. We can actually specify how on what device we want it to take up all the rows. So if we actually write the column X for extra small ones to take up to 3 rows, then it means it will take up to 3 all the way down until the extra small devices. So we can simply type in call XS 3, and that means it will only take a fourth all the way down from the largest devices up to the smallest one. And lastly, let's also add a card class to it. And I'm going to go ahead and copy paste this 4 times and then do that another 4 times. We want 16. So 4, 8, 12, 16. Okay, it's a little crowded here, but that should be 16 divs right there. Looking good so far, guys. Let's go back to step number 10 now. Okay, and finally, we can add the supplied fav icon to the site. So let's go ahead and remember we have our fav icon here. So let's go to the top here. We can do it on top of our Bootstrap library. We can do another link here that is specify which fav icon it is. Now I have a little shortcut here for my snippets for HTML, but all you need here, the attributes would be the rel, which would be the relation to the document for this fav icon, the h-reference to the location. This was created for me from my snippet, but it's not an ICO, it's a PNG file. And make sure you have your type as well, which is an image/x icon. Okay, let's go back to our project here. And that's it for step 10. So now we can begin and start creating out our styling. Okay, for step 11, before our Bootstrap link tag, we're going to add a CSS reset. Now, in order to actually structure this a little easier and it's for more conventions, I'm going to create a CSS folder inside of resources. And inside that CSS folder, we're going to create the reset file. So I have an integrated terminal in my Visual Studio Code text editor. So I'm going to go ahead and go and navigate into my project, go inside my resources, and then it's here I'm going to create a CSS folder. I'm going to change into that CSS folder, and I'm going to create a reset.css file here. So if we go back into our project structure here, you can see we have our folder and we have a reset CSS. It's looking good here. So the goal of reset style sheet is to reduce browser inconsistencies. If you look at some sites in different browsers, each browser has its own user style agent, and they're going to have a specified way of styling their headers, their margins, and font sizes. So if we want our game to be displayed in the same way for every browser, we actually have to reset all the CSS for every browser, and then we can style it on our own. So we're going to fill it out, and there's many reset CSS styles that you can actually grab online. One that is very popular is from mayorweb.com/eric/tools/css/reset. If you click on the hint again, it will direct you into that article and it will direct you to that CSS. So I've already copied it and I'm just going to paste it in here. And that will allow us to actually reset the CSS of our game. And make sure you do it, you'll link to the CSS before your Bootstrap link. Otherwise, it will be overwritten and it won't work. So let's go ahead and link our CSS right atop our Bootstrap link and go ahead and save that and make sure that your h-references is correct. So it's not index.html. I have to go into resources. Then I have to go to CSS and then I can link the CSS style sheet. Save that again and then we can continue on to step 12. Okay, for step 12, we're going to be importing a work sans from the Google Fonts. So let's go into fonts.google. We're going to go ahead and search for work sans. Let's go here, work sans. Stay here. There we go. We're going to add this and we are going to grab certain stylings for that. So we're going to grab all the font weights used in the design specs. I've already looked at the design spec, and we know we actually have 3 specific font weights that we're going to grab. So click on the Add button here, open up the family selected, and we're going to customize it so we can grab the regular, the bold, and the black. So 400, 700, and 900 font weight, and click on the embed link, and then we can actually grab the link here. Go ahead and grab it and copy it, and we can go back into our actual project, and you can link in right after our fav icon link. Okay, looking good. So now we actually can use this font family from Google and when we're styling our game. Okay, let's move on to step 13. So for step 13, we're going to create and link to an empty style CSS file. So the reason I created the sources folder here, so we can actually add any other kind of style related files. So in here, I'm going to create another file here that's called style.css, and we're going to link that sheet as well. Make sure you do it after your bootstrap so it doesn't override everything else. So we want bootstrap to be thing that overrides the resetting, and then lastly we want our own styling to override anything that was specified that from bootstrap. Because if we have bootstrap at the end, we style something like a paragraph, bootstrap will override it. So make sure that your link to your own CSS style sheet is at the bottom of your title of your head tag. And make sure the reference here is correct, so we know that it's on resources, CSS, and then style. Go ahead and save that. Also, you can add a type here that says text.css for both of your links here for the CSS styling sheets. So let's go text/CSS and go ahead and save that again, and then we can move forward here. Okay, in step 14, we're going to actually start doing some styling. So inside our style CSS, we're going to set the text color, the background color, and font family specified in the design specs. To save some time and not go back and forth and give you vertigo, I already have the specs opened up in another link. So I'm going to be looking at the actual specs as I type these out. All right, and I know we're going to add these to the actual body, so all the content within body will have the certain specific background color. So looking at the specs, let's go ahead and specify the background color will be RGB 255 242 242. We're going to set the font family to work sans. And another option will be sans serif if work sans is not available. Make sure you add your semicolons when you're writing CSS2, otherwise you'll get an error and it won't actually produce the right color. And lastly, we want the color as well to be RGB. This will be the text color, 32, 64, and 86. So go ahead and save that, and let's go back into our actual match game and see if it actually worked. Okay, it looks like it actually worked, so let me take out the element. So you can see the color background change to like a slightly pinkish color. Let me zoom in a little more. And the color is specified on the actual style sheet that's grabbed from Bootstrap as well. Okay, good so far. Let's move on to step 15. Now we're going to add space to the top of the page. In order to add space, we can simply add a padding to our page. So let's go to here, and we're going to add padding into the container class. So let's call it by calling .container. And we're going to do padding top, and I believe that will be 5.25 rem. Semicolons, go ahead and save that and double check over here, and there we go. Okay, let's go to step 16. So now we actually have to apply the correct font sizes. You can see that this has a bolder kind of font compared to the paragraph and the H2 headers here. You want the correct font sizes and the weights in the instructions text as specified, as described in the specs. So we're going to be adding that to the H1, H2, and the P tags here. So let's go back to the project here. For the H1, we're going to add a font size of 2.5 rem, and the font weight will be bold. The font weight bold here is going to be grabbed from the actual Google fonts that we added here. For our H2 tag, our font size will be 1 rem, and our font weight will also be bold. And for our P tag, paragraph within the instructions. Trying to make some space. We're going to just change the color to RGB 74, 74, and 74. So go ahead and save that, and we can go ahead and look at the changes that we've actually done for our actual page. So it's kind of looking now more like the example we have in our specs here. One other thing, we actually have a base font if we look at our specs here of 14px, and I'm going to do that on the actual HTML tag, so we have everything within the HTML to be the specific font. So let's open up our HTML tag here, and let's set the font size to 14px. So it will look a little smaller. Let's go ahead and refresh, and there we go. Okay, it's looking good so far, guys, and let's move on to step 17, where we're actually going to be styling the cards themselves now. So we're going to set the height, background color, border, and border radius of these cards. Let's go back to our project here. We know that there's a class we have for those cards called the card. We're going to be setting in the height, background color, border. I'm just typing this so I don't forget it. Border radius. Comment this out. So let's see. The height will be 12.5 rem. We're going to set the border background color to be RGB 32, 64, and 86. The border, we're going to set it to 4px, solid white. You can also do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the actual tag for white color. And let's do a border radius as well. We'll set that to 8 pixels. So let's go ahead and save that. Go back into our actual match game. Refresh, and you can see the actual cards have been displayed now. So if you look into our project, it's kind of looking similar. It's a little squished in this one because we have our actual instructions displayed here, but we have actually styled successfully our match game, and it looks quite well. It looks pretty decent. Bootstrap has very nice and very useful kind of bordering. But you might not see the white. If you zoom in, you will see that it actually have a border on the cards. It's kind of subtle, but it does a good, it looks good as to separate the actual cards. Okay, let's go back to the project. In step 18, we're going to style what the card looks like when it's face up, and we're going to add a number inside the card, the first card. Then we're going to center and style the text based on the design specs. So we're going to ignore the face-up colors for now because we're going to adjust that with jQuery. You know that when we turn the cards, they have a specific color, but we're actually going to do that, use jQuery to actually render those colors. So all we need to do is simply just adjust it so that when we flip a card, it has this kind of font weight, it's centered, and it looks like that when we turn it around. So let's go back into our project here, and we're going to add some more styling here. But before we add the styling, let's actually hard code a number into the first card. Let's put an 8 here and save that and see what it looks like without styling. You can't really see it at the moment because we actually haven't changed the color of the actual text. So let's go into the card tag here. I'm going to delete my comment from the line 30, and we'll start writing our actual styling for this card. So for starters, we want the color of the number to be RGB 255, 255, 255, 255. We also want, oh, I think I have an extra 5 here. There we go. Okay. We want the font size, since it's nice and large. The font size will be 7 rem. We want the font weight to be the darkest color that we grabbed from the Google Fonts, which is 900. And we want to actually center it. So how are we going to center the number inside our card? So we want to use Flex in this case. So Flexbox is a layout mode in CSS3, and before Flexbox, the previous version of CSS defined 4 layout modes. It had block layout, inline layout, table layout, and position layout. And Flexbox just allows it it's really easy to use, and it makes it easier to actually organize how you're going to display containers in certain divs. So if we want our cards to actually start being used as flex, we can actually set the display to flex. And now we can actually start calling some certain flex classes on it, and it will display it in certain ways. Once we have the display set to flex, we can actually call certain properties from flex. Now we're going to set up the justify content property. And what justified contents is, this basically defines the alignment along the main axis. So it helps distribute extra free space left over when either all the flex items on a line are inflexible or they're flexible but have reached their maximum size. And it also kind of exerts some control over the alignments of the items when they overflow the line. So in order to justify content has certain properties that we actually can call. There's flex start, flex end, and there are a few others one. We just simply want to center the actual content within our flex cards. And last thing, inside the cards themselves, we want to align all the items there, and we just want them to go into the center. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's look how it looks now with our 8 here. So you can see that our 8 is displayed properly. The font weight is 900 as we set up from the Google fonts, and it's looking good, pretty similar to how we have them here on our actual game. Okay, let's move on to step number 19. Okay, I got disconnected for a second, guys, so I'm back at it. Let's go on to step 19. So in many browsers, when you hover over the numbers on the card, your cursor turns into a text cursor, which is the one I actually have displayed here. This doesn't really look that great when you go over the cards, and you can see that this is different for the actual end product here. So we're going to call the cursor property, and we're going to set it to pointer, so it's displayed as a little pointer when we go over the cards, like it does here in our end product. So let's go back to our project right over here. All we need to do here is specify the cursor to pointer, and that's it, and we can test it out. So we go ahead and refresh, and you see that we have the pointer set to the cards when we actually hover over them. Okay. Step 20, that is it for our board. We have it fully styled and it's ready to become interactive. So we're going to be working with some JavaScript now. So we're going to go ahead and delete the fake number value we have added on our first card. So let's go to our project again and delete it from the HTML page. Go ahead and save that, and we can finally move on to actually using JavaScript and jQuery to implement certain functions here. Okay, let's start with step number 29. Okay, in step 21, so during the following tasks, we're going to be implementing the function called generate card values. Now, generate card values is a function that's going to create and return an array of 8 randomly ordered matching pairs of values that will represent the order of cards on the game board. So I want you to pause the video for a second and think about the steps that we're going to be needing to implement this function. And kind of write it down, maybe write them as a pseudocode or comment it on your matchgame.js file, and think about how we're going to actually implement the cards. So once you're done with that, check on step 21, and let's move on to step 22. So step 22 displays the actual steps we're going to be using to implement the function. With the 3 steps we're going to be doing is first create a sequentially ordered in ascending order array with 2 copies of every number from 1 through 8. So this array will hold 16 values, 8 unique numbers. Each number will have a duplicate or a copy of each number. Then we're going to transfer those numbers randomly to a new array, and then we're going to return that new array with randomly ordered numbers. So compare the steps you had written to the steps you actually have here from step 22. Remember, it's always good to break down functions into smaller kind of functions and kind of put them together at the end. It's a little easier to wrap your head around how you're going to structure this and create the actual functions. So kind of think about this, and we're going to be reapplying this kind of logic and this kind of way of breaking down large functions into smaller ones in the next few tasks. Once you're ready and this makes sense to you, move on to step 23. We're actually going to start creating this function. Okay, for step 23 in the next few tasks, we're going to generate the array of all possible values in order. So let's go to our matchgame.js, and we're going to start the generate card values method by creating an empty array that represents the unplaced in order card values. So let's go ahead to match.js. So open up your project structure here. Let's go to matchgame.js, and all the way to the top around line 12, you should have your function here. And we're simply going to start out by writing a variable that is an empty array. I'm going to call them sequential values because it makes quite sense to me. So you can name it whatever you'd like. This kind of just makes sense to me. So we'll start out with writing an empty variable called sequential values, and this will hold the numbered ordered from 1 all the way to 8 and their copies. So 16 numbers total, 8 unique numbers, 16 values total. Okay. Go ahead and save that, and we'll move on to the next step. All right, step 24, we're going to write a loop to iterate through each card value. We're going to do 1 through 8. So we're going to write a for loop here. And our for loop will start out with the first value will be 1. So, you've probably seen for loops before where we start out with 0. In this case, we're going to use the value itself to generate, to put it into our sequential values array. Since our game is not focusing, it's not using 0 values, we're going to start from 1 all the way to 8. So we'll start our for loop. We're going to set the variable name, I'm going to call it value. We're starting out with 1. We're going to keep iterating through the loop as long as value is less than or equal to 8. And we're going to be increasing value by 1. Okay, looking good. Go ahead and save this. And let's go back to our instructions onto step 25. Okay, in step 25, inside our loop, we're actually going to add the current value to your array of unplaced values twice. So we can simply push this value here, since we're iterating from 1 to 8. We're going to push that one value into our sequentials values array, and we're going to do that twice. So we have 2 copies of that number. So sequential values dot push will push a value into an array, and we're going to do that twice. So we have 2 copies of the same number. Okay, looking good. Let's go on to step 26. Okay, in the next 2 tasks, we're going to need to transfer those values from the unplaced values array to the randomly ordered array. So we're going to create an empty array representing the randomly ordered card values. So I'm going to call this is going to be outside our for loop, of course, and I'm going to call this variable simply card values. So this will be what we're going to end up returning at the end, which will be basically all the numbers we have for our game. Okay, check step 26, and let's go ahead and move on to step 27 here. Okay, for step 27, we're going to create a while loop that runs until the sequentially ordered array is empty. So be careful not to run your code yet, because it will be the loop will never terminate. It will be an infinite loop. So how are we going to write this while loop? We're going to be removing values from the sequentially ordered array. So we're going to keep looping and iterating until that array is empty. So this is going to make more sense in a second. Let's start out by simply writing our while loop. So our while loop will keep iterating as long as sequential values, the length of it is more than 0. So the breakpoint will be when sequential values is empty. So sequential values dot length is more than 1. So keep going all the way until sequential values is empty. So open up your code block and leave it empty for now. Okay, let's move on to step 28. Okay, for step 28. So within the loop, we're going to generate a random index in the array of in-order unplaced values. So it's going to be a random number from 0 to the length of the unplaced values array. And to accomplish this, we can use math.random method. So we need to create a random number that is from 0 to the length of the unplaced values array. So we know that the unplaced values array right over here is 16 times long, because we're pushing value twice from 1 to 8. So we know it's 16. So essentially, sequential values is going to be returning something that's 1, 1, 2, 2, all the way up to 8, 8. So 16 values. So we need to grab a random index that accesses that array and grabs one value from that array and pushes it into card values. And we actually have to remove that element as well from sequential values. So let's break this down a little further. Let's start by creating a random index. So how do we create a random index? Well, we can use math.random for that. So we're going to store that random index in a variable. And since I've been saying it quite a bit in the past few seconds, we're going to call that variable called math_random index. So how do we do this? Well, we know that math_random will create a floating point number from 0 all the way to 1, but not including 1. And I can show you this. I'm going to open up my terminal. Let me clear this out and zoom in a little bit, not too much. If I call in let me open up my node first. If I call math.random, you will see that I'm generating a random number between 0 all the way, but not including 1. So what I need to do is multiply math.random times the length of my sequential values. So if I do math.random times 16, for example, it will return us basically a number from 0 all the way to 16. but it's still floating. So we need to figure out how are we actually going to round that down. One simple way of doing that is calling math.floor. And math.floor basically that's just a function that returns the largest integer less than or equal to a given number. So the largest integer less than 13.9 will be 13. The largest integer or less than or equal to 9.35 will be 9. So if you call math.floor on this little function we have here, we will get a whole number. So you can see that will be giving us a random number. And we're going to use this as an index that we can access into our actual sequential values. So I'm going to get rid of my console here. Okay, so what we're going to write exactly what we did. First, we create a random number, calling math.randomNumber. Then we're going to multiply that number times the sequential values length. And now we're getting a random number between basically 1 to 16, but we need to round that number down. So we can call math.floor on those values. So now we're going to get an actual random index, which is a whole number. Okay, it's looking good. So let's move on to step 29. In step 29, we're going to access that, that value in the unplaced values array at the random index you just created. And we're going to add this value to the end of your randomly placed values array. Okay, so let's go ahead and create another variable here, which will be the random value. So now we have a random index, we can simply access it with brackets. So what array are we grabbing this random index from? Well, we're grabbing it from sequential values. And how do we access an element in an array? Well, we can use brackets here, and we can simply pass in the random index. Now that we have the random index, we can push that random value into our card values array. So we can call card values dot push random value. Now there's one error in this code here, and maybe you can pick it up. What is happening here? What is the issue? We are looping through sequential values until the length is, as long as the length is more than 0. So pause for a second, maybe think about what's going on here, and it will say in the instructions, but I want you to maybe try to figure this out on your own before we actually go further. Okay, we'll move on to step 30. And if you didn't notice, we're actually not removing the element if we just access the element from the sequential value and add it to card values. So we need to actually change the sequential values array. So we got to remove the element at the random index from the sequentially ordered values array. And we're going to use .splice method to accomplish this. So let's go back to our code here. And instead of simply accessing it, we're going to call .splice. So what does .splice do? Well, VS Code helpfully has a little description of the methods, built-in methods from JavaScript. So splice is basically, it removes an elements from an array, and if necessary, it inserts new elements in their place, returning the deleted elements. So there's a few optional arguments that we can pass into splice. One of the options, the first parameter would be the starting position on the array that we're actually going to execute this code, the delete count, and an optional number as well. So we're going to delete only one element, and we want to delete it at the random index that we're actually passing in through. So all we have to do is pass in the random index, and we're only going to delete one value. So take a quick second to look at this again. Remember, we have the random index, which is taken from the sequential values with math random and math floor. And then we're going to grab that index from the sequential values and remove it. And this will actually return us the actual value itself inside an array. So we can't really push in, and we don't want a nested array. If we push this into card values, we would get something that's essentially that. So we want to actually have just pass in the values so we can pass in the values. So if we're returning an array, all we need to do is access the first and only element from that array. So now we have the value. So instead of grabbing the actual array, we have the value of 5. So feel free to go ahead and test this out. You'll see that you'll get an array without this 0 bracket here of accessing it. So now that we have the value assigned to random value, we can actually push that value into card values. And this will also remove the value from sequential values. So this will be, sequential values will be removing one value from it on every iteration. So no longer this will be an infinite loop. Before actually just accessing it and pushing it into card values, that was just creating an infinite loop because we were never modifying sequential values array. Okay, looking good so far. Go ahead and save this as well. And let's move forward. So after both loops are complete, we will now have a randomly ordered array of every value on the board. So now we can just return the randomly ordered array from the function. So after both our loops, we simply want to return card values here. And that basically is our generate card values function. So you can see we went through the 3 steps. We created an array with random with the values from 1 to 8 that have duplicate numbers for each. Then we created a new loop where we iterate over that sequential ordered array, and we removed each value from the sequential ordered array, and we inserted those values into our actual card values array. So we're going to be returning an array containing randomly ordered values, but each value will have a copy of itself, and it will only go from 1 to 8. Okay, so it's looking good. So if this worked properly, we should be actually, and if we call this method, it should return us an array of these values. Okay, let's move on to step 32. Okay, in step 32, we're going to open the JavaScript console on our actual project, and we're going to run the method match game generate card values, which is the one we just wrote, a few times to make sure it's working. And then when we're confident, we can just run the test and ensure that generate card values is now passing. You will probably see the other test failing, and let's go ahead and test this out. So let's open up our project on our browser, and let's also make sure you refresh as well to ensure that it refreshes the script. And go to your console and make sure you call match game .generate card values, and you'll see that we have an array containing 16 elements, and it has a copy of each element, which is the numbers from 1 to 8. So you see 3 is copied once here, 6 is copied again here. Let's run it again one more time, and you can see it's different every time we run it, meaning it's randomized, and there is no 3 copies of any element. So it seems to be working completely fine. And let's go ahead and call match game tests as well. And let's go run tests and see that we have the other test failing. So we have render cards failing and flip cards failing, but the other test should be failing. We got an undefined here, meaning there was nothing returned because the actual test passed. And this is just a kind of side effect from running a function in the console. So I'm going to go ahead and clear out the terminals again. And if you want to just double check, you can call match game tests test and do generate card values. So this should not return anything. It should just give us undefined, because if there was an error, the error would be returned. So in this case, there is no error, meaning everything passed, and just an implicit side effect that we have from running functions that don't return anything at the end is a console log of undefined. Okay, so we're looking good, guys. Let's go ahead and move on to the next step and the next task, which will be implementing the render cards function. Okay, so now we have a function that generates a board of random values, and we need to turn these random values into visible cards on the web page, just like we had here on our project. So in order to do that, in the next few tasks, we're going to implement a method called render cards that takes an array of card values and a jQuery object representing the game. And keep an eye on this, the way it's written here. That's going to be basically the variable name of the jQuery object to represent the game. And then render cards will then create jQuery objects representing cards and add them to the game. So the method will store information about the value and color of each card as they're added. And so this information will be used by a different function that styles cards when they are flipped over. So take, same as we did on the previous step, take a second to think about the steps we need to implement this function. And when you've laid them out, you're going to move on to the next step. So I know it might seem daunting, but go ahead and kind of break down the larger idea of what we're trying to do and kind of break it down into many small steps, and try to figure out how we're actually going to display the cards on here. We have div elements, so how we're going to actually attach these numbers that we have grabbed from the generating the card values and display them on the cards here. So once you're done, go ahead and move on to step 34. Okay, in step 34, these are the steps that we're going to be using to implement the render cards function. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to empty the game objects HTML. So we want to make sure that when we call this function, we empty everything out, and then we create a new iteration so we can actually display the cards. Step 2 is going to be generating the jQuery objects for each card and include data about the value, color, and the flip status of each card. So there's some certain information about each card that we have to keep in mind. So you know that these have specific colors. You can notice that matching cards have the same color, for example, and they're also not the same as the other cards. And we also know whether a card is flipped or not. So there's certain 3 things that we need to keep in mind: is the value, which is a number, the color, and whether it's flipped or not. And last thing we want to do is we want to add the card objects onto the game object, which is the div container that we actually created below our game instructions. So compare the steps that you these steps to the ones you've created and see how the approach is differed. Once again, there's many ways of actually creating this game. There's never really a one way to do coding in programs and applications. There are many variations. Some are better than others. Some have their benefits. Some have their pros and cons. So if you have a very different idea, don't panic. This is not the right and only way to code the game. This is just the way it's going to be coded for in our specific project. If you feel adventurous, go ahead and give it a shot with your own idea once you completed this project. So if you had a different process or approach of actually creating this, that's totally fine. Go ahead and try it out. Okay, let's move on to step 35, and we're going to start by creating the method now. Okay, in step 35, we're going to start by emptying the HTML of the game object. So let's go back into our project here. We're going to scroll down to render cards right over here. And let's start out by simply creating a jQuery object of the game. So remember, in our index.html, we have a div container for the game. The actual game containing all the cards has an ID of game. So we can use jQuery to actually create a variable that holds that container. So let's start by calling it var user $sign here. For convention, jQuery variables usually have a $sign before them. So we're going to use jQuery to use $sign to actually call jQuery, and then we're going to specify what element we're going to grab. Since it has an ID of game, we're going to prepend it with a hash and grab that element. So now we have the game object, a jQuery object containing game. In order to empty it out, we can simply call .empty, which is a jQuery function that empties out everything that's contained within any kind of text that's contained within that game, within that element. So let's go ahead and simply call game and then empty. And that's all we need to do for that step. So go ahead and save this and move on to step 36. Okay, so in step 36, we're actually going to start by generating jQuery card objects for each value in the card values array. Remember, we created it with a previous function called generate card values. So when that function is called, we'll be returned an array with all these card values. So we're going to start by looping through each value in the card values array argument. So let's go back to our project here, and we'll start our loop. So it'll be a for loop. I'm going to call this variable value index. We're going to start it out at 0. We're going to continue iterating as long as value index is less than the length of card values. And remember, we're passing in card values as a parameter in this function, so that will be an array. And we're simply going to increase value index by 1. So open up your curly brackets to start up your code block, and that's it for step 36. So let's go on to step 37. So inside our loop, we're going to create a jQuery object for each new card. So this object should be instantiated or created with the same HTML code that we use to render a card in our index.html. So let's go back into our project and look at the styling we have for our cards. So all we need to do is create basically a jQuery, an element that contains this information here. Okay, so let's go back to our match game.js. In order to do this, all we need to do is, I'll start by creating a card element here. And since this is a jQuery object, I'm going to call this variable card element with a $sign prepended to it. And we're going to set it equal to element jQuery object that contains the same kind of styling we have from the HTML. So now we have a jQuery object that is essentially containing the styling for this div container. Okay. That's it for step 37. Let's go on to step 38. In step 38, we're going to use the data method provided by jQuery, and we're going to add a data attribute representing the card's value on the new card object, and setting the value of the data attribute equal to the value at the current index in the card's values array. So data object is basically a way to set some arbitrary data information to a jQuery element or DOM element that we have assigned here. So we're going to attach certain data. Remember, we want to keep in mind, as we said in the instructions in the previous step, we want to keep in mind whether the card is flipped or not, the color, and the actual value. So what we need to do here, we're trying to actually add or store certain data onto the DOM element. So I'm going to actually create an object in this case because we're going to be adding three things into three pieces of data into that card, and it just makes more sense for me. Instead of calling .data and passing the key and value 3 times, I can simply create an object and pass that object into the data attribute when we call .data on the card element. So what essentially is going to be happening is I'm going to call .data on our card element, and I'm going to pass in this data object. So this data object will be stored in an object and being passed into the card element so we can actually store that data. So let's go ahead and grab the value. I'm going to grab the value. I'm going to create a variable called value. And now what we want to do, again, once more, is we want to set the value of the data attribute equal to the value at the current index of the card values array. So the value of the current index of the card value array. So we have the card values, and in order to actually grab the current index of that, we have a variable called value index, which is grabbed from the for loop. So all we need to do is call value index, and that will be an iteration that we have from the loop and the stored value. So this will give us basically a random number that's taken from the card values array. And we can create an object here since it's called data, and we're going to pass in value as value. I like to put a trailing comma just in case we add more datas into this object. I can just simply press enter and pass in the information. Okay, looking good. Let's go ahead and save this. Move on to step 39. So in addition to knowing the card's value, we also need to know whether the card or not the card has been flipped. So we're going to add another data attribute to the jQuery card object representing whether or not the card has been flipped. And this value should default to false. So this is basically indicating that this will be a Boolean value. So I'm going to call this basically an isFlipped property, which will be the name of our data key property. And we're going to set it to default to false. Okay, and we can move to step 40. Okay, so finally, each card value will have a unique color. So we got to go to the beginning of our renderCards method and create an array containing the 8 HSL values listed in the design spec strings. So if we go to our spec again, we'll see that we have different card colors on click. So when we click on the cards, there will be certain colors. And if you notice, there's only 8 colors because we have pairs. So even though we have 16 cards, we're only going to be using 8 colors. Okay, so we're going to be writing this at the top of our function here, and I'm going to set this to a variable called colors. So var colors will be equal to an array that will hold all these colors. So I already copy pasted to save some time from typing, so I'm going to just paste the colors here. Okay, we can move on to step 41. Okay, for step 41, so now we're going to add a data attribute to the card to store its color, and we're going to set its color by matching the card's value to the color at a position in the color array. So since the values of the cards are 1 through 8, we got to actually subtract 1 from the card's value to find the index of the corresponding color in our array. So let's go back to our project here. So we have our colors array, which are marked down from the 0th index all the way up to 7. Whereas our card values themselves are only from 1 to 8. So in order to actually grab the color, we have to subtract 1 from the value itself, because this value will only go from 1 to 8, and the colors will go from 0 to 7. Okay, so let's make another variable here. We'll call it color. We're going to set it equal to colors, and we're going to grab the index of the value minus 1, so there'll be a value of 0 to 7th, and then we're going to add that as another data attribute to our card. So we can simply type in color and pass that color onto the actual card object. And there we go. Okay, let's go back to the instructions and move on to step 42. Okay, for step 42, now that we actually have all the data and information for our card object or element, we can simply append that card element into our game tag. So let's go back to our project once again, and right after actually adding the data itself, we can grab our game object, which is a jQuery object, and call append to it, which is a jQuery function from it, and we'll pass in the card element itself. So initially it was only this element, which is a div containing the class of call xs3 and another class of card, and then we also added data onto that element. So each card will have a specific data on itself. So it will have its value. It will be false is flipped, so it will be unflipped by default, and we'll have a color specifying from the colors array here. So all the cards will have a specific data for each of them, and then we're going to append that card element into our game ID, which we have here, which is inside our rows. Okay, go ahead and save that, and we can move back to our instructions here, and let's go to step 43. Okay, in step 43, we can now generate the HTML for a game. So we're going to use the generate cards value function, and we're going to use the render cards functions method to render the randomly arranged cards to the page. We're also going to add a document.ready statement at the top of our match game JS file, and we're going to call matchgame.renderCards inside of it, inside of its callback function. So jQuery you can call document ready. So when the actual document or the HTML and all the images are loaded, we can actually call some jQuery on it to basically set up our game before it even starts. So we're also going to pass .renderCards method an array of randomly ordered card values. So we actually have to call our generate cards value function to generate those values. And I know we created a variable for game ID with a jQuery object with that. We're actually going to do that in our document ready function as well. Okay, so let's go at the top of our file here, and I'm going to grab this right here. So I'm going to take that out, and we're going to use that to create our actual document ready function here at the top. So right before writing these methods here for generate card value, let's go ahead and call our jQuery method here. So document, I'm going to call .ready and pass a callback function to this. One more time here, there we go. And inside our callback function, we're gonna do is create a game jQuery object, which I just grabbed from our previous function, and then we're gonna create a variable called values. And what we're gonna pass in here is a call to the function generate card values. So I'm gonna call match game generate card values. So remember, this returns an array of randomly ordered values that we grabbed for our cards from 1 to 8. Once we do that, we can actually call render cards, matchgame.renderCards, and we can pass in the values parameter and the game itself, the game object here. Okay, it's looking good. Let's go back in here, and then can move on to step 44. Okay, congratulations guys. You've now created and rendered randomly generated HTML using JavaScript. Since we're rendering the board in JavaScript, you can actually delete all of the HTML inside of the game HTML element. So let's go ahead and remove all these cards here. Right there. Go ahead and save that, and let's go into our actual game and refresh this. And it doesn't seem to be working. Let's go back into our match game.js. Let's go to our render cards function and look at our iteration here. And you might have caught this, but I am not grabbing the length of our card values, so our loop is actually not iterating through the length here. So just make sure you type in the length here as well and save that. So mistakes are going to happen quite often. Don't expect to write this code right off the bat with zero mistakes. So don't panic too much if you actually make a few errors on the way there. So let's go ahead and refresh this and make sure you save it. And there we go. We were able to actually render our cards onto the game. So keep Keep into account that we're actually not rendering the colors or any kind of other information at the moment. That is simply some data attributes that we're actually putting into our div containers here. It's some data that each of these card elements contains. We still haven't displayed it yet, but if we actually console log the data itself, it should be exposed to it. And if you would just want to double check that it's actually grabbing the data and putting it into the cards, you can simply console log it. Let's go ahead and console log the value and the color. So the way to do that is grab the jQuery element. So it's called card element. We can access a data from that element by wrapping it in strings. So we know that the value, we can actually console log that. And let's also console log the color. So card element data and then color. So if we go ahead and refresh our pager, we should be getting all the cards values. So they're hidden right now, but we have them displayed here on our console. We have the values for each card and the specific color. So if you notice, the colors are matching the same valued card. So if you look at 1, we have 1 at the bottom here. They both have the same color. Same with 4 right here and 4 right here. Okay, so it's looking good. I'm going to go ahead and clear the terminal one more time. You can do Command K to clear it up. And let's get rid of this console log and go back to the instructions. And we'll implement the last function here. So now we have to implement the flip card function for step 45. So in step 45, the final step is to implement the flip card function, which will add the dynamic behavior of flipping a card when it's selected and unflipping cards that don't match. So this method will take 2 jQuery objects, the card being flipped, which we're going to call card, and the game that is being played, which is game. So I want you to pause this video for a second and go ahead and think about the steps needed to implement the function. So when you've laid them out, you're going to move on to the next task. So think of how we're actually going to use jQuery to flip the cards and see if there's a matching card with it, and how we're going to display those colors, and how we're going to flip them back if they're not being matched. Okay, so take a second to think this through, and once you're done, unpause and move on to step 46. Okay, for step 46, these are the following steps we're going to go through to actually implement this function. So step 1, we're going to ensure that the card being flipped is not already flipped. We're going to modify the card being flipped so that it appears flipped over. We're also going to add a newly flipped card to an array of flipped cards stored on the game object. Then we're going to check if a match has been made. So we want to make sure if there are 2 cards that have been flipped are the same. And if they are, we're going to gray out the cards, so if a match is made. So if we actually, let's take a look here, see if I can find a quick match here. There we go. So if they're matching numbers, then we gray them out and we actually leave them displayed. Then we're going to flip the card over if the match is not made. So if we click 2 cards and there is not a match, we're going to flip them over. So notice there's actually a timeout. It's after like less than a second. And lastly, we're going to clear the game's array of flipped cards and to get ready for the next pair. Okay, so compare these steps to the ones you've created and see if the approaches are different. Once again, if they're very different, don't worry about it too much. Your approach might still work. This is just a specific way we're going to work through it. So we're going to be following this structure. If you want to go ahead and give it a shot, feel free to try and go ahead and do so. But let's go on to step 47. We're actually going to start implementing this function. All right, to start, your jQuery object will need information about which cards are flipped. So at the top of our render cards method, we're going to add a data attribute to game, which keeps track of the flipped cards. So this should be initialized by initially set equal to an empty array. So I'm going to do this in our render cards method, and I'm actually going to do this right before we clear out the game. So right here on line 53, right after we clear it out actually. So we're going to call game, and we're going to set a new data attribute to our actual game itself. So we're going to grab all the cards that are flipped, and we're going to store them into an array. We're going to be flipping 2 cards at a time. So remember, we can flip more than 2 cards. So we're going to create a data attribute called the flipped cards. And we're going to initialize it as an empty array. So when we click on a card, we're actually going to insert that card into this flipped cards array. And then we can use conditionals, for example, to check if those 2 cards have the same value. So hopefully this is making more sense. Let me add my little semicolon here and save that one more time. Okay, let's move on now to step 48. Okay, and flip card, which is the method we're going to write, you need to flip a card if it has not been previously flipped, or do nothing if it has been already flipped. So you see if we flip a card and we click it again, we're not going to do anything, but if it's not flipped, we can actually flip it. So we're going to start the method by checking if the selected card is already flipped, and this information should be stored in the data attribute that was specified in render cards. So remember, we have a data attribute in our render method. Let's go back here, which we have a boolean called isFlipped, which is the key, and it's defaulted as false. So we're going to be changing this. If it's false, we're going to change it to true, and if it's false, we're going to make sure we if it's true, we're going to make sure we don't do anything to it. Okay, so we're going to store it in that variable, and we want to check if it's flipped or not, and then return from the function so that the function stops executing. So that's important. We want to, if it's been flipped and we click it again, we simply want to return in order to stop the execution of that function. So let's go back to our project over here, and we're going to scroll all the way down to, oh, here we go. Sorry, I was a little hidden here. To our last method here. So flip card is a function that we got a little setup here. We have two parameters. We have a card and a game parameter, and notice that these are jQuery objects which are indicated by using the $sign. So we have our card element, which is a jQuery object, so we can call .data on that element. So let's do our conditional. We want to check if the data attribute is flipped is true. And if it's true, we simply return and execute the function. We don't have to do anything. So let's go ahead and call card data. And when we access data attributes with data, we got to make sure that they're wrapped in strings. So these key attributes are strings. So we got to make sure if isFlipped is wrapped in quotes. So if isFlipped is true, then we're simply going to return. And that simply executes, basically terminates a function and doesn't do anything. So right after that, if the card is flipped, we just return and exit this function and do nothing. Okay, save that again, and let's move on. Now we can move on to step 49. Okay, we're getting closer to the end, guys. Okay, so for step 49, if the card has not been flipped, we're going to modify it so it appears flipped over. So we're going to change the background color of the card to be the color stored on the card. We're also going to change the text of the card to be the value stored on the card. And then we're going to update the data on the card to indicate that it has been flipped over. So we're going to change three things basically on step 49. Let's go back to our matchGame.js file, and we're going to be filling out the rest of that method right here. So we're going to do three things. We're going to change the CSS. We're going to change the text to actually to be the value of the card. And lastly, we're also going to change the data attribute of isFlipped to true. So let's go ahead and call a card. We're going to do three things. CSS. We're going to call CSS. I'm going to change these methods so we don't forget. We're going to change the text, and we're also going to change a data attribute. So let's start out with the CSS first. So what we need to do, we're going to change the background color. So we can simply use jQuery's CSS function to actually change the background color. And the second parameter to this would be the color we want to change. So we can type in red, blue, but in this case, we simply want to grab the data attribute of that specific car to the stored color attribute. So we got to change it to, card.data. And remember I said you have to pass in the key property for data types as strings. Okay, so that would change the background color of that card to the card that's stored in the data. Next thing we need to do is change the text. So what we got to do is change the text to the actual value, which is the number we have stored. So how do we access the data type? Same thing as we've been doing. We grab the card, not data, card.data, and we pass in the value as a string. Okay, looks good. And last thing we want to do is change the isFlipped data attribute to true. So we can just simply call isFlipped and the data call here, and we want to change it to true. So we change those three things. So we change those three things now: the background color, the text, and the data. Okay, looks good. Save that, and we'll move forward to step 50. Okay, so at this point, flipping a card will render correctly, but we still need to check it for a match when two cards have been flipped over. So after we finish styling the flip card and flip card, we're going to push the card until the end of the game object's array of flipped cards. So remember, we have an array that stores basically all the flipped cards, which is attached to the game object. And we're going to actually push that into the flipped cards. So I'm going to make this clearer, make this easy and readable. So I'm simply just going to create a variable called var flipped cards, and I'm going to set it to the data attribute that we have stored, which is an empty array. So the game has a data attribute called flipped cards, which is at the moment an empty array. So if you look right over here, and in our render cards function, we basically set up our game to have a data attribute called flipped cards, which stores all the flipped cards in an empty array. So we're going to push this card into the flipped cards array. So flipped cards dot push, and we're going to push that specific card. Okay, it's looking good. Let's move forward. For step 51, we're going to check if the game has two flipped cards. So we know that when we actually push a card, it will update the flipped cards array, and it will have one value. If we click on another card, we're going to push two values into it. So we're going to check first if flipped cards, the length of that is equal to 2, then we're going to execute some code. Okay, let's move forward into step 52. So in step 52, if two cards are flipped, we want to check to see if they are the same value. And if they're the same value, we're going to update the card's background color and the color. So let's go back. So there's only going to be two elements inside our flipped cards. So we got to check if their value are the same. So let's do another if conditional here. So first we check if there are two cards, and then we have to check if the two cards in that array are the same value. And how are we going to grab the value? Where each card has a data attribute key property called value as well. So we have a flipped cards, which would be an array containing two elements. So first let's check if the first element, not that, it would be flipped cards and the first element, 0. That will be a card object that has a data attribute, and we want to grab its value and check if that value of that card is equal to the second element of that array, to that's value as well. Okay, and then we're going to execute some code in here. So if they're a match, we want to update their CSS. We want to update the background color, and we want to update the color. Now, in order to maintain a very dry code, dry meaning don't repeat yourself, I'm going to make another object here called match CSS that's going to store the colors for these cards. And then I'm going to call .css on these cards and pass in the object containing the actual attributes that we're going to be changing. So let's start by creating our match CSS object. We're going to change the background color. Background, I can spell background. Background color. And in case you're wondering, when we pass the CSS, when we pass it into our CSS function, jQuery is smart enough to know that this background color, camel case, will be changed to background color, which is the actual appropriate color for CSS, because CSS doesn't take in background color. It won't understand that. So jQuery is smart enough to actually change it to background-color. So let's look at the spec and to see what color we're actually going to change it to. So if we look right over here, if they are a match, we want to change the background color to this color, grayish. And we want to change the text as well to this color. So 204, 204, 204, and then 153, 153, 153. So let's go ahead and wrap that in quotes. So RGB for the background color will be 153, 153, 153. And then we're going to change the actual color of our number, of our text or font, to 204, 204, 204. So that'll be a little grayed out. So now we actually have to pass this into each of those flipped cards which are matched. So flipped cards 0.css match CSS, and then we'll do the same and we'll just change this to 1. Okay, looking good so far. So now we're actually checking if there are two cards in the flipped array. Then we're checking if the values of those flipped cards are equal to each other. And if they are equal to each other, then we're gonna change their CSS, and this should be CSS here, not CAS. And go ahead and save that. Okay, it's looking good. Save it and move on to step 53. Let's scroll down. Okay, now we have to figure out what we're gonna do if the cards are not a match. So we're gonna flip them back over by resetting the background color and then setting the text to an empty string and updating the data to reflect that the card has not been flipped over. Okay, so let's go back here and let's do this as an else statement. So we're gonna store these flipped cards as well and into variables. So var card1. It's just easier to type card1 instead of flipped cards first element. So flipped cards, the first one will be card1. Var card2. Card2 will be flipped cards 1. And now we actually can change the color. So we need to change the background color. We need to change the text to an empty string, and want to update the data attribute of isFlipped to false. So we can do that by simply doing something similar we did right over here at the top. See how we change all three things at the same time. We can do the same by doing card1. We're going to change the background color with CSS. We're going to change the text to an empty string, and we're going to update the data attribute of isFlipped. So we're going to change the background color back to its original state. So let's go back here and see where you actually have the background color. Here we go. The grayed out kind of dark bluish color that we have displayed on the game is 326486. So let's go ahead and change the background color if they're not a match. Back to RGB 326486. Then we can change the text to an empty string. I'm going to indent this a little bit. And let's go ahead and update the data as well of isFlipped to false. Okay, and we can do the same right here to card2 as well. So we're basically changing them back to flipping them over to its original state. Okay, and my text editor kind of indents a little bit when I copy paste code, so don't worry about it. It's the same, it will function the same way. Okay, go ahead and save that. Let's go back to our instructions, and we're almost getting there. So for step 54, finally we're going to set the array of flipped cards on the game object to be a new empty array, whether or not the cards were a match, because we don't want to keep feeding more elements into a flipped cards array. So we have to actually reset the flipped cards back to an empty array after we actually go through our conditionals here. So right outside here, after our conditional, we're going to go ahead and update our game data. Game.data, flipped cards will be back reset into an empty array. Okay, it's looking good. Save that. Let's go to step 55. So we still haven't really set up, if we click on the cards, they're not really going to turn around. For step 55, we're going to add that event listener at the end of render cards. So this listener should call flip card whenever a card is clicked, and we want to make sure to call flip card with jQuery objects containing the card that was clicked on and the game elements. So we got to be careful to update just the card that was clicked and not all elements with the class card. So it's important to create this event listener at the end of render cards instead of document ready, because we can only guarantee that the cards will be created at the end of render cards. So if we try to attach click handlers to elements that don't exist, they will never be created. Okay, does that make sense? We have to make sure that we add them after we actually render the cards. So this has to be at the end of our function to make sure that the cards are actually rendered before we add an event handler, a click handler for it to listen to. So let's go back to our render function outside our for loop, and right at the end of our function here, we can actually start writing our click handler. So we're going to be calling it on the card class. So let's set up our jQuery here. We're going to be calling the dot card. We're going to change the actual, when we click on that specific class, we're going to flip the card. And remember, this click function, I'm not setting it on all cards. I'm adding a click function so it knows what card I'm clicking. So I'm going to add a click function to that element. And in order to know what card I'm clicking on, there's a keyword that jQuery provides. It's called this, which it will kind of find in the DOM where I'm clicking, where I'm actually firing this event, and it will know what element I'm actually specifying. So we want to call flip card function and use the this keyword so it knows what card specifically we're referring to. Okay, so we're going to call flip card, and remember, flip card is part of the match game object. So in order to do that, we have to first call match game dot flip card. And remember that flip card here takes two elements, the card and the game attribute. So when I click on a card, we can pass in the this keyword. And when we use this keyword with jQuery, we have to wrap it in a $ in parentheses. So whenever you use a this keyword inside a jQuery like that, you have to actually wrap it in like this. And then we can pass in the second parameter, which will be the game attribute. And I'm just simply going to pass in the actual jQuery object, and I'm going to call it game like that, because we know that there's an ID of game for that object itself. Okay, let's go on to the next step. Now we can try out, refresh the page and try out the game. So it should work, but you're going to notice that when a pair isn't found, the cards automatically flip back, not giving the user time to even look at the second card. So make sure you saved your file, and let's go into our actual game, refresh it, and test it out. So fortunately, we actually got a match on the first one, but you see it's not actually working properly. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my project here. Scroll the way down. Let's see what's going on. Okay, so I notice right here on our CSS that I mistyped background color. Once again, you might have noticed that. Please don't yell at me. It was a simple mistake here. Okay, let's go ahead. I already refreshed my browser here. So let's see if the error that the instructions indicated actually happened. We have no time to actually click on both cards because we're flipping on the card if there is no match. So we're not able to actually reveal the cards. We need to actually do something a little different and modify it in order to give us a second to see the other card before they flip them over. It will only be flipped if there are matches. That seems to work, but if there are not matches, we don't have enough time to actually see the other card. Okay, let me go ahead and refresh this once more. Let's go back into the instructions here. So we gotta actually set up problem here says, you may notice that when a pair isn't found, the cards automatically flip back over, not giving the user time to even look at the second card. So now we can use set timeout to add a delay to the flip. So we want to use set timeout in order to give us a second to actually look at the other card and try to memorize it in order to see it. So set timeout basically calls a function or evaluates an expression of any kind after a specified number of milliseconds. Okay. So what we can do is basically wrap in the else function here, the code that's being executed here to change the colors. We want to do that after a couple of seconds. So we don't want to do it right immediately. So in order to do that, we can simply call set timeout on a window, which is basically the window on the browser here. So we can call window.setTimeout, and then set timeout will basically take the callback function. So we're going to pass in a callback function here. And the second parameter will be the number of milliseconds that we're going to be passing in. So our callback function, I'm writing it like this, so we can actually write in how many milliseconds we're actually going to pass. Now, they don't specify in the instructions. I'm going to put in 350 milliseconds because that'll be enough time for us to actually look at the code itself before it actually is flipped over. Go ahead and open up your code block, and all you have to do is grab your cards, the way you're changing the colors, and paste that in inside the callback function. Okay, so let's go ahead and try this out in our actual game itself. So let's go ahead and refresh and see that we now change the actual background color after 350 seconds. If you change this to maybe 1,000 milliseconds, which is 1 second, and refresh this, you'll notice that it will stay a little bit longer. So you can modify this, the milliseconds, as long as you want. You could even maybe think of levels, so 350 seconds. If you do maybe 200, it'll be way faster, but you get the idea. So let's change it back to 350, and it seems to be working fine at this point. So after step 56, all we have to do is simply run our tests and make sure that they all pass. Like we tried before, if all tests are passing, then we shouldn't be returning any errors here. For this case, if we actually run our test, match game tests dot run tests right over here, all tests have been passing. So we have completed the project here, guys. That was a long project, and we basically took into account everything we've learned so far from JavaScript, Bootstrap, and jQuery. Now, like I said in the previous steps, there are many ways to actually approach this game and modify it. Remember, this is more up to you and up to the creator of who created the app to actually write all these functions in their own way. And there are many, many different approaches to actually write this application. This game, we followed specific instructions, which made some sense, but there are many other ways you can actually write this application. Now you feel free to customize it and add your own features. We have a few options here that we have provided you some ideas. Maybe you can indicate that the user won when all pairs have been found. Maybe use jQuery to like have it, float in from the side. Game had ended. Maybe add a restart button into that container. You have only allowed 2 cards to be visible at a time. Instead of having more than 2 or whatever, you can change the card values to non-number values. What if you want an image instead of just a number? There's many other features that you can add. So go ahead and take a look at what we've written. If you feel like changing the functions themselves and maybe trying your own approach, maybe you initially thought of another way of writing it, then go ahead and feel free to do so. So I'm going to zoom out in case you want to actually see and double check what I wrote compared to what you have. Feel free to take a second and take a look at the functions here. I have the render cards function right there. Feel free to pause if you'd like to. Same with our flipped cards and at the top as well. So double check if anything's confusing. Just make sure you have no spelling mistakes. A lot of times that happens. And make sure you console log a lot of stuff. It's easier to figure out what's the problem is if you maybe on console log something you thought had a value and it comes out as undefined in your DevTools. Anyway, that concludes our project for today. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you all next time.